Dengue is a viral illness. It's an illness that causes fever and can potentially cause severe disease. It's transmitted by mosquitoes and occurs mainly in urban and semi-urban regions all over the world. At the moment, there are approximately 400 million people potentially affected by dengue. 100 million of those symptomatic, but all stages included, so very severe to almost asymptomatic. But what is interesting, there's been a massive increase of incidence in the past 2 decades. Like in the early 1990s, there were around 400,000 cases of dengue, and this has now increased to over 1.2, 1.3 million by 2010, 2012. It's a real issue, it's a real important issue. This is why development of vaccine is really important, because there's no treatment for this disease. This increase of incidence hasn't sort of been a homogeneous occurrence, it's actually patchy. So you have different epidemics, you have isolated outbreaks. For example, in Europe, which might be interesting, there was an outbreak on the island of Madeira of Portugal, 2012, I think. There have been cases reported in Croatia, in Greece. So dengue is actually in Europe as well. It's not a classic tropical disease. It's actually sort of within the tropical, subtropical belt of the world. So the disease is transmitted by mosquitoes. So these are Aedes mosquitoes. Actually, if there was one here, you would see it. It's got these very nice white bands. It's a black mosquito. There are sort of 2 major types. There's lots of different types of Aedes, but there's Aedes aegypti and there's Aedes albopictus, which means the white-socked mosquito. And the aegypti transmits dengue more in the African tropical regions, whereas albopictus is more in the European and South American regions and Asian regions as well. These mosquitoes are active during the day. They breed in clean water. This is really important because in the cities, you have lots of containers all over the place which collect rainwater or clean water where these mosquitoes lay their eggs. And obviously these are breeding sites. And these things need to be, you need to create an awareness among the people to improve these measures. These are part of vector management strategies. So generally everyone is at risk across the world, but children are slightly more at risk because they spend more time outdoors, especially kids. There's sort of this cutoff age of around 8 to 9 years when they transition from being at home a lot to being away from home a lot. And obviously they're exposed to all sorts of zoonotic diseases, ticks, lice, fleas, mites, but also mosquitoes. And they then accumulate these immune responses and these exposures to these vector-borne diseases. But no, everyone is exposed to these mosquito bites. So when you get bitten by an infected mosquito carrying the dengue virus, I might need to say quickly there are 4 serotypes of dengue virus. You will get infected with one of those serotypes, and it takes between 2 and 10 days incubation period for symptoms to arise. It usually starts off with fever, with a typical headache, sort of retroorbital behind the eyes, sort of a pounding pain. I can speak from experience. I had dengue myself while working in Laos, a type 1 serotype, and you get this bone pain, and this is really quite pronounced. You can get in joints and in the lower back, but they're all non-specific symptoms. This could easily be malaria, it could be a rickettsial illness, it could be leptospirosis. So it's a flu-like disease, just like influenza could be. But if you get it again, and you get a different serotype, I might explain that later a bit more in detail, you can then get severe dengue. And that actually, severe dengue can manifest quite differently. You can get bleeding, you can bleed from the gums, from the skin, from the intestines or in the lung. You have a leakage of the vasculature, so the blood vessels become leaky. So the cells which close the blood vessels actually become leaky and blood plasma can go through. So you get fluid accumulation and you get thickening of the blood. And this is a really severe status. So the thing is, you can't treat dengue. You can manage it really well, but there is no like specific treatment. There's not an antibiotic you can give because it's a viral illness, but the management is crucial. So early detection, diagnostics is important, but diagnostics is important also to prevent the wrong use of antibiotics. Nowadays we have these problems with antimicrobial resistance everywhere. So having a diagnosis is helpful in not giving antibiotics, but also in focusing medical staff towards improved management. So if you get severe dengue, mortality can be up to 20%. It can be very high. But if you manage it properly with fluids, you can bring that down to 0.1 or even lower percent. So it's actually, if properly managed, it's not a deadly disease anymore. Well, it's a vector-borne disease, so again, you have to prevent the vector from getting at you. So you can use repellents, is what we advise to all the travelers. We advise to use bed nets at night to prevent the mosquitoes from coming. There's all sorts of more entomological approaches to treat areas to prevent breeding of mosquitoes in hotspots, for example. But that's the hallmark, is to prevent getting bitten. The fact that there are 4 serotypes, so there's type 1, 2, 3 and 4, makes it really tricky for the development of a vaccine. And the problem is that these 4 serotypes, so the 4 viruses, are extremely similar in their outer membrane protein construction. So when we get one, like I had dengue type 1, so my immune response was an anti-type 1 response. It's a very specific response, it works quite well, brings down the virus in the blood, and I had this flu-like illness, and then after 4 or 5 days I was getting well again. But if I now get a type 2, 3 or 4, so another than the first infection, I'm at risk of getting severe dengue. And the reason is that the body makes immune memory cells based on the first infection. And when you get dengue again, because they're so similar, these viruses, it will take the immune memory response and make the same anti-type 1 memory response against the type 2, 3 or 4 you would get. So the immune protection is suboptimal. So the antibodies which bind the virus don't bind it perfectly, and that leads to bad control of virus. It leads to uptake of virus into cells, which it wants, because it wants to replicate within cells, and it leads to incomplete destruction of the virus. And that's why, and this, you call this antibody-dependent enhancement. And this enhancement creates a higher virus load in your blood, and then leads to much more severe disease. Knowing this, you need to take this into consideration when you develop a vaccine. So obviously, if you make a vaccine which is an anti-type 1 vaccine, you're at risk of creating more severe disease if you get a type 2, 3 or 4 subsequently, because of this antibody-dependent enhancement issue. So the current dengue vaccine is a tetravalent live, so it's a live virus. Tetravalent meaning it covers all 4 serotypes. Vaccine based on the yellow fever vaccine body, but with dengue outer membrane proteins attached. And it induces a very strong immune response. And as these vaccine trials were going through the different phases, phase 1, phase 2, people noticed that children 5 years old or younger were more prone to have severe disease than children which were older, sort of 9-year-old. So exactly this different stage where kids are more at home versus kids are out and playing in the jungle or in the fields. The first step, they had to restrict the licensing to the vaccine being used only children 9 years old and older into adults. So it's from 9 years to 60-year-olds, because again, the other end of the spectrum, very old people immunity is not very good because of the immunosenescence, the aging of the immune response or immune system. So the vaccine was decided to be given between 9 and 60 years old. And when taken to the phase 3 trials, there was actually a positive effect. You could see there is a reduction in severe dengue in this group and also a reduction in hospitalization rates. So this is a bit in a nutshell the difficulties and the effects of the vaccine. I mean, there's still a lot of research going on in terms of this vaccine. There's a lot of debate as to, is the vaccine actually a benefit? Because it still could be associated with more severe disease. Initially, there were about 250,000 or 300,000 children which were vaccinated, so aged 9 or older. And one of the major findings in this period was that if you had a previous exposure to dengue, so you had a natural immune response, pre-existing, you were more likely to be protected after the vaccine was employed. But those kids who were naive, which means they hadn't had any contact with dengue before, and then got vaccinated, were more likely to have severe dengue as their next case. So within the 3-year period follow-up, so if they would get dengue, there would be more severe cases in the naive vaccinated as compared to the previously exposed and vaccinated kids. So this is a really important thing to consider. And so there were modelers, so mathematical modelers who take into account different factors, environmental factors, vector control factors, treatment, susceptibility, etc. Put it all into one big black box and then predict how many cases can occur or could be prevented. You can use this for cost effectiveness issues, but they mainly did it to see how many severe cases because of vaccination would occur beyond 3 years of vaccination. And taking into account vector control measures as well, it was clearly found that the pre-existing natural immune response has to be there when you vaccinate. So WHO has taken this into their guidelines, and you can only use this vaccine in hyperendemic areas or in highly endemic areas where there's a lot of dengue and where you would expect approximately 70% of people to have antibodies against dengue. The lowest would be 50% if you want. So anything lower than 50% you would not vaccinate anymore. So this is a consideration. At the moment, this might change, but at the moment this is what WHO recommends. I think getting funding for dengue is definitely easier than for other neglected tropical diseases because dengue is a leading cause of hospitalization across the world. It's a leading cause of febrile illness. It's well known to be very severe if you get it a second time. And I think the fact that there is a vaccine already sort of implies that funding is easier to get. There's a lot of trials going on. And for drugs, there is still, this is a big black box. There's still very limited antiviral drugs available. I mean, there are antiviral drugs which are being used for hepatitis B and C, which is in the news recently. Very expensive, but they work. But for dengue, these drugs do not exist yet, and there are still ongoing efforts to get funding to look for these drugs. Dengue is a great topic to talk about diagnostics because it actually, the principle, if you understand the principle, actually applies to quite a number of zoonotic diseases or vector-borne transmitted diseases. And the principle is that once you get bitten by a mosquito, the virus goes in the skin, is taken up by skin cells. These skin cells, loaded with the virus, go to your lymph nodes, wherever they are. And then there is a replication phase, and then they spill over into the blood. And then you have a lot of virus in the blood, like really a lot, like millions. And this is called viremia, the virus in the blood phase. And this phase sort of, comes up and then it comes down again as the human produces antibodies, because the antibodies then bind to the virus, and the antibodies are made for our specific macrophages, so cells, monocytes, macrophages, to take up opsonized, so proteins which are coated in these antibodies, and then they're taken out of the blood and they go into tissues. So you have a phase in the blood, and then you have an antibody phase. And this is exactly how you should design your diagnostic strategy. So in an early stage of the disease, you would look for proteins of viruses in the blood, or for DNA of viruses, whereas in the later stage, you would look at antibodies, because they then come up. So for dengue, there is a double test. There is a NS1, so it's an antigen. It's a non-structural protein of the virus, NS, non-structural, which is picked out by an antibody. And then in the second phase, you look at the IgMs or IgG antibodies, and taking those together, you cover the entire spectrum of the dissemination and the immune response, and you're able to diagnose with very high accuracy dengue.